Hi, Marc, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views report on European politics. And today, once again, we need to talk about the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Because according to US intelligence services, Russia has suffered heavy losses in recent months in the war of aggression against Ukraine started by Putin. Since December alone, more than 20,000 soldiers have been killed and around 80,000 wounded. That was said by the National Security Council's communications director, John Kirby, on Monday in Washington. After the statements, it initially remained unclear whether the intelligence information reflected the war in Ukraine as a whole or just the battle for the embattled city of Bakhmut. However, a representative of the National Security Council made it clear to the German press agency on Tuesday that the number of victims relates to the fighting throughout Ukraine, although the numbers cannot be independently verified. About half of the fallen soldiers on the Russian side are mercenaries from the Wagner troops, Kirby said. Most of them were Russian convicts sent to war without adequate combat training or experience. Kirby did not provide any information about the victims on the Ukrainian side, though. US Chief of Staff Marc reported in November that more than 100,000 Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded in the first 8 months of the war. The same probably applies to the Ukrainian side, he said at the time. After its invasion more than 14 months ago, Russia controls almost a fifth of Ukraine's territory, including the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea, which was annexed in 2014. The eastern town of Bakhmut has been attacked jointly by the Russian army and the Wagner troops for months. According to their own statements, the attackers now control around 85% of the city area. Kirby said the strategic value of Russia recapturing Bakhmut was small and would not turn the tide of the war in Russia's favor. For Russia, these efforts, especially in Bakhmut, come at a very, very high price, Kirby said. Russia's stockpiles of weapons and troops are exhausted as well, but Ukraine's defenses in the areas around Bakhmut remain strong. But Ukraine's hopes for a more concrete prospect of joining NATO are in danger of being dashed for the time being. According to information from the German press agency, alliance members such as the United States and Germany have recently made it clear behind closed doors that they do not want to make any commitments for the time being that go substantially beyond a vague NATO declaration from 2008. In it, the then heads of state and government agreed that Ukraine and Georgia should join NATO. However, there was no concrete timetable mentioned for this. And meanwhile, the foreign ministry in Kiev emphasized that Ukraine is not a problem but an advantage for the military alliance. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has clearly outlined Ukraine's expectations. At the Vilnius summit, Ukraine is expecting a commitment from its allies that will determine their path to NATO membership. That's how a ministry spokesman, Ole Nikolenko, wrote this on Facebook on Tuesday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky recently called on NATO to clear the way for his country to join the Western military alliance at its next summit in July. Neither in Ukraine nor in Europe nor in NATO would the majority of the population understand if Kiev did not receive a well-deserved invitation to the summit meeting in Lithuania, as Zelensky said after a visit by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to Kiev. As justification, he explained that hardly anyone is currently contributing more to Euro-Atlantic security than the Ukrainian soldiers. His country has therefore done everything to ensure that the application from Kiev is granted. Zelensky is getting support for his demands from Central and Eastern European countries, such as the summit host Lithuania. However, it is currently extremely unlikely that they will be able to persuade NATO partners such as the USA to change course. According to diplomats, opponents of a concrete prospect of a cession explain their position by saying that this goal is currently not realistic and it could distract from the much more important support for Ukraine. In addition, There is a risk that new NATO commitments could provide Russian President Vladimir Putin with arguments for even more aggressive warfare. During Stoltenberg's visit to Kiev 2 weeks ago, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov renewed statements that Russia sees possible NATO membership as a threat. Accordingly, accession would be a serious, significant danger for our country for its security, he said. In order to be able to accommodate Ukraine at the NATO summit in Lithuania, according to diplomats, work is currently underway on a support package already announced by Stoltenberg. In addition, there is talk of offering Ukraine the opportunity to hold talks on even closer cooperation in the form of a NATO-Ukraine Council. A senior diplomat recently said that this could strengthen the sense of partnership between NATO and Ukraine and make a real difference. So far, NATO has only met with representatives of Ukraine in the form of so-called commission meetings. They used to be primarily about reform requirements. According to information from NATO circles, there will probably only be real movement in the talks about Ukraine's accession prospects if Ukraine succeeds in the war against Russia. Then the NATO states would not have to fear becoming a direct party to the war by admitting Ukraine. Secretary General Stoltenberg recently indirectly ruled out Ukraine's accession in the time of war. He pointed out that NATO membership requires Ukraine to survive the war as an independent nation. If Ukraine does not assert itself as a sovereign independent nation in Europe, then there is no point in discussing membership. That is what he said on the sidelines of a meeting of the International Contact Group for the Coordination of Military Aid to Ukraine. And at the request of the German press agency, the government of US President Joe Biden did not comment on the internal talks before the summit in Lithuania. However, they indirectly confirmed that they consider firmer arms deliveries and other aid for Ukraine to be more important in the current situation than plans for joining NATO. We are concentrating on getting more practical support into the hands of the Ukrainians as soon as possible, is what a senior government official told the DPA. They are also examining what can be done in the longer term to strengthen Ukraine's ability to counter and deter aggression. On the subject of accession prospects, they only made it clear that the USA does not question the NATO declaration of 2008. It's not a question of whether Ukraine will join the alliance, but when, they said. And the German federal government recently made a similar public statement. A government spokeswoman explained almost 2 weeks ago that the focus is now on further military, financial, and humanitarian support for the country. At the moment, there is no decision on Ukraine's accession, they said. However, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the UK government should help Ukraine join NATO as soon as possible. That was reported by the Russian agency. Speaking to British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, Johnson stressed that the alliance's summit to be held in Vilnius on July 11th and 12th will be an important test of NATO's readiness to fulfill its long-standing commitments to Ukraine. In response to Johnson, Cleverly stressed that NATO has a clear position on Ukraine for which an invitation to join NATO has been prepared. Cleverly emphasized that he thought it was incredibly important that this topic did not deviate from the agenda. Because, as I said earlier, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba said that the decision on Ukraine's membership in NATO will depend on the 4 member countries of the alliance, and one of them is particularly big and important. On February 24th in last year, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that he had decided to conduct a special military operation to protect Donbas in response to a request for assistance from the heads of the LPR and the DPR there. The decision to conduct the operation was the reason for new sanctions against Russia by the United States and its allies. And what they always put as a special military operation or military special operation or whatever is nothing else but a war. And that's why I mentioned it in the end of the video again. It's a war, period. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.